Broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Today's program follows a system from how it was built to how it shows up in real places to who absorbs the cost.
We begin with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, with a look at its origins and structure. How immigration enforcement became intertwined with policing, detention, and punishment, and how that power has grown over time.
Then we move from architecture to atmosphere. We'll hear from a Michigander who went to Minneapolis during mass protests to describe what it felt like on the street and what solidarity looks like.
In the second hour, we turn to the classroom. A Detroit teacher describes the students who are suddenly gone and what it does to learning when fear is part of the school day.
And we'll hear from an organizer working to protect immigrant students and families. Power in practice and the people living inside its reach. This is the Metro.
We begin in Minneapolis, where the killing of 2 Americans by federal immigration officers has forced the country to look more closely at immigration and customs enforcement. When we apply that closer lens, the scrutiny moves beyond individual agents to the system itself. It's a system built through laws, budgets, and a long-standing decision to treat immigration as a criminal problem. Professor César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández studies that system where it's most hidden, where immigration enforcement operates like criminal policing and detention functions like punishment. He's a law professor at Ohio State University. His latest book is Welcome the Wretched, in defense of the quote-unquote criminal alien. In this moment of intensified enforcement, we're asking, what kind of immigration system is actually being built in the name of Americans? And what choices a city like Detroit truly has? Professor, welcome.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So before we get into the origins of ICE, Professor, you've studied immigration enforcement quite deeply. Have you seen anything like ICE's current incursion on U.S. cities before?
That's right, Robyn. I think one of the first things we have to clarify is that we're not just dealing with ICE here. The Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency is certainly one key part of the federal government's immigration law enforcement apparatus, but it's only one part. It has a partner agency in Border Patrol, which is actually just one component of an agency called Customs and Border Protection, CBP. And the Border Patrol has just the same responsibility as ICE to enforce federal immigration law, but where they differ is on their geographic focus. While the Border Patrol is historically focused on the U.S.'s external boundaries, ICE is focused on enforcing immigration law within the nation's interior. And historically, the Border Patrol has had the vast majority of its agents deployed to the U.S.-Mexican border. And so it's absolutely, I think, essential to keep in mind that while ICE is it's an easy three-letter word to remember, these are in fact distinct agencies. They have their own histories, their own operational cultures. They draw from different pools of people. And as a result, we have to keep that history in mind when we're looking at what's unfolding in cities around the United States, because while what we've seen in places like Minneapolis and LA and other Chicago elsewhere is abnormal for ICE, it is much more in line with the Border Patrol's operations and some of the legal justifications that the courts have given them. And I think here, one of the things that is unusual under the second Trump administration is that we are seeing these massive deployments of immigration agents in which we have officers from multiple law enforcement agencies, including Border Patrol, ICE, and others that are working together.
So it's important to remember it is not just ICE. When we talk about immigration enforcement, we're talking about these different agencies working together. But ICE is, as you have noted, the agency that has rose to great prominence in this moment, particularly because of its work in the interior of the U.S. Could you give us a quick origin story of ICE, or if you feel that it's more important to talk about immigration enforcement more broadly, that works too. Whatever you think you can tell us in a concise way. I know it's a big ask.
No, certainly, I'm happy to. The nice part is that the history of ICE is not a very long history. That's a new agency. It was created formally by the Homeland Security Act of 2002, which was enacted under the presidency of George W. Bush as one of the federal government's responses to the attacks of September 11, 2001. But it wasn't launched operationally until the following year, 2003. So this is an agency that is not even a quarter century old, right? It's very much in its adolescent, young adult stages of life, and as a result, it is an agency where, because it's so new, we can imagine what immigration law enforcement looked like before the agency existed. That was all of the 20th century, and in the 25 years or so since it was effectively launched, it has transformed quite significantly from a very small agency to one that has these days a historically unprecedented amount of funding, and is in the midst of a rapid increase in its personnel, courtesy of congressional appropriations bill that President Trump signed last spring.
So the creation of ICE has been transformative in the U.S. when we think about immigration enforcement.
When we think about interior U.S. immigration enforcement, because prior to that, interior enforcement was really relegated to an afterthought, as part of the responsibilities of what was then the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS. But the INS's responsibilities were always primarily focused on the borders, with just some afterthought consideration to the nation's interior. ICE, by contrast, it has as its primary responsibility enforcement of immigration law within the interior of the United States.
I want to think about how ICE's role and immigration enforcement has changed in recent years. I want to bring in a voice from a decade ago. This is then President Barack Obama. This is in 2014, and he's laying out how his administration said it wanted to approach immigration enforcement, focusing on serious crimes while avoiding mass roundups.
Even as we focus on deporting criminals, the fact is millions of immigrants in every state, of every race and nationality, still live here illegally. And let's be honest, tracking down, rounding up, and deporting millions of people isn't realistic. Anyone who suggests otherwise isn't being straight with you. It's also not who we are as Americans.
Okay, then President Barack Obama, that was the stated goal in 2014. Fairness, restraint, focus. Professor, based on your research, how much of that vision actually reshaped the enforcement system, and how much of the machinery stayed in place?
Under President Obama, one of the key transformations between the federal government's immigration enforcement apparatus, or within the federal government's immigration enforcement apparatus, took place behind closed doors, that is, inside county jails, and through the development of computer networks that could speak to one another across the federal government and their partners in state and local governments. This was something that wasn't being played out in the scenes of U.S. cities in the way that we've seen more recently, but which was incredibly consequential, because what developed in that period of time under President Obama was a very close partnership between the federal immigration law enforcement agencies and state police forces, and more significantly in that, municipal city police forces and county sheriffs. County sheriffs are absolutely critical in this conversation because it's, of course, county sheriffs that run the vast majority of jails in the United States. And so when people get arrested for any ordinary offense, from the most serious to the most minor traffic offenses, they get booked into a county jail. And one of the developments that the Obama administration really emphasized was to make sure that ICE and had access to information about people who were being arrested for whatever offense, their identities, and that way, and then also developing computer databases that could quickly sift through identification information, names, birth dates, fingerprints, photographs, to identify or to decide whether or not ICE was interested in potentially taking custody of that individual, and then beginning the long process of potentially removing them from the United States.
Professor, are you saying then that what Obama did essentially was lay the foundation, lay the groundwork for a lot of the enforcement that we're seeing today?
Absolutely, the technological foundation was developed under the Obama presidency, but more importantly than that, the very premise that the federal government ought to be turning to state and local law enforcement agencies as critical partners in identifying more people who might be potentially removable from the United States. That was something that was heavily emphasized during the Obama administration, and which the Trump administration the first time around, and the Biden administration after him, really continued. One of the extraordinary things that we've seen over the last few weeks is actually the breakdown, a shifting of direction, if you will, in that decades-long relationship between the federal government and state and local counterparts. We see in Minneapolis that there is very little cooperation. That part is unusual, but because for many years now, we have seen the Department of Homeland Security emphasize quite substantially developing good, close working relationships with local police departments and sheriff's departments, under the realization that they just have more staff in more cities, who are encountering more people on a daily basis than DHS ever can.
Professor, I want to think about that for a moment. The cooperation, often the very quiet cooperation between federal immigration officers and local and state police agencies, because there is so much talk about whether local and state police should cooperate with ICE. And this is something that we hear advocates pushing for, is for these local and state agencies not to cooperate with ICE. What my immigration reporting always seemed to indicate, and it sounds very much like what your body of work has indicated as well, and what you're saying is that mostly they do. Mostly there is some level of cooperation across the country between federal immigration officers and local and state agencies. And it's very unusual, is what you're saying, for them not to cooperate. And that's why this moment feels anomalous.
That's right, but just to be absolutely clear, this is still a fairly new phenomenon. This is a post-September 11, 2001 phenomenon, in which the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency has really spent a lot of energy, a lot of time, and a lot of money creating these relationships and the technological infrastructure to support these relationships, and it has become the norm. That's true of rural sheriff's departments. It's true of big city police departments. There are close working relationships, and that should not be surprising. Law enforcement agencies, law enforcement officers tend to want good working relationships with their partners in federal law enforcement agencies, and should not be any surprise that that's true in the immigration context as well. What is unusual is just over the last few weeks where we've seen a complete breakdown in the relationship, at least between federal immigration authorities and their counterparts in the state of Minnesota, specifically in Minneapolis. This is, of course, not happening in places like Texas and Florida, but it is happening in this one context. And to be frank, it seems like in other cities where the Trump administration has deployed these large numbers of immigration officers to enforce the law, and quite aggressively, the relationships there have been souring as well. We've seen in Portland, Oregon, for example, the chief of police complaining about having officers tear gassed with no notice. That's not the way that you go about making friends or keeping friends, and that's true no matter who you are, even if you are the Trump administration.
It's the Metro on WDET. I'm Robyn Vincent. My guest is Professor César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández. We're tracing the origins of ICE and how it came to wield so much power as scrutiny intensifies nationwide. Now, Professor, the reason President Obama made the changes that he was talking about that we listened to just a few minutes ago is because much of the public was upset about people coming into the country in a way that skirted traditional immigration rules. Do we find that as that happens, more enforcement and even brutality of organizations like ICE is ramped up?
I don't think there's any reason to conclude that law enforcement has to become brutal as it becomes more widespread. That is a policy choice. That is a choice of tactics. We have seen in the past, in fact, that prior presidential administrations have deported similar numbers of people as what we're currently seeing under the Trump administration, or even more numbers of people than what we're currently seeing, without resort to the kind of physical violence that has become the norm, has become expected in communities around the United States. And so I would push back on this notion that in order to enforce the law, we have it to expect law enforcement officers to use brutal means of doing so. The law, frankly, gives them great leeway to use violence. Arresting people usually involves some form of violence, but it is one thing to use that legally permissible violence, and another thing completely to engage in the kind of indiscriminate brutality and death that we're seeing in places like Minneapolis.
I want to discuss your latest book and how it relates to this moment, Welcome to the Wretched, because it takes on the label criminal alien. And I'm doing air quotes right now because I realize that there are quotes in that in the title. Why has that phrase been so politically useful?
The phrase criminal alien resonates with people because it evokes the fear of the unknown, the fear of the other, the fear of the person who speaks different than you, looks differently than you, eats differently than you, and walks differently than you. And so it's a comfortable foil for politicians to wave around and claim, look, these people are dangerous because we don't know what they're like, we don't know who they are, we don't know what they're saying in our within earshot, and therefore we ought to be suspicious. We ought to watch them closely, and if we can, we ought to remove them from our communities because they are shaping, they are altering, they are degrading the fabric of our communities. And we see this obviously very clearly in the rhetoric of President Trump and top officials within his administration, but even in President Obama. And that in November of 2014, it may have been the same speech that you clipped from earlier. He says, my administration, I'll paraphrase here, but he says, my administration is going after felons, not families. as if family members don't involve felons, as if felons don't have family members, as if felons are all vicious individuals. The reality is that felonies run the gamut
Yeah.
of activity, and the vast majority of people who do commit crime grow out of those most antisocial moments of their lives. And so the idea of Welcome the Wretched is that we're all as humans, we're all worthy of rehabilitation, we're all worthy of redemption. And the fact of the matter is we all have those warts in our background, in our lives, and certainly in our families' lives, from which we try to shy away from, hide, and hope that it doesn't become an anchor around our future selves.
Right. This is the contrasting ideas here. I mean, America has been a country that has said we believe in people's ability to grow and change, and what you're saying is immigration policy is flying in the face of that. A lot of Americans assume immigration enforcement targets the worst of the worst. Based on your research, how often is that the case?
What we see is just statistically is that the majority of people who are being removed from the United States these days have no criminal history whatsoever, and that changes. That percentage changes over the course of administration to administration. Sometimes administrations, will try to target more specifically people who do have criminal records. I think the Obama administration, in fact, did this by relying so heavily on county jails and local police officers to flag individuals for ICE. The Trump administration has taken a far more indiscriminate perspective. Yes, they keep rhetorically saying we're going after the worst of the worst, and saying that in more vicious ways. But of course, what we're seeing is that what they're actually doing is just running, driving through streets, and breaking windows of whoever they want to pull over. That's a very crude way of identifying anyone. Certainly not a very good way of identifying people who have any kind of violent history or violent tendency. But I think the broader point that I make in Welcome the Wretched is that that this is not the role of immigration law. If what we're concerned about is public safety, we have an entire legal law enforcement apparatus called the local police, called the criminal court system, called state and federal prosecutors. We're not shy in the United States about imprisoning people. We're not shy about imprisoning people for a very, very long time. Adding an entire immigration and customs enforcement agency to that is duplicative at best, and I think at worst, what it does is imposes some severe harms on migrant communities, simply because of the accident of birth, that subjects some people to the secondary consequence of immigration law, deportation and detention, that is off the table for folks who happen to have been born in the United States.
Professor, what I am hearing from you, and we did already talk about this briefly, but I want to emphasize this point. The immigration enforcement that we're seeing right now, it is more based on spectacle and visibility. But for you, someone who studies immigration enforcement, you are saying this is more of the same.
Yeah, I think that's right. We're seeing more of the same on steroids. I certainly don't want to suggest that the Obama administration is like the Trump administration, or even frankly the Bush administration is not like the Trump administration. No, the kind of viciousness, the kind of violence, the kind of aggressiveness, that where the lives of people who are disagreeing with the Trump administration's immigration priorities are seemingly irrelevant, meaningless, or worse. They're just tools in a rhetorical political game of demonizing greater portions of the population of the United States, that is unusual. That is highly problematic. That is a phenomenon of the Trump administration. But when it comes to the technological infrastructure, and when it comes to the relationships between the federal government and their state and local counterparts, that part is not new. And so I think what we're seeing is that the Trump administration is doing, again, what it's so good at, is taking what was already a well-developed immigration law enforcement apparatus that worked on a large scale, and bolstering it with very little regard to the consequences.
Let's move from President Obama, who we heard from earlier, and now let's fast forward. This is how the Trump administration has described ICE's authority. Here's Stephen Miller, then a senior Homeland Security advisor, talking about what ICE officers should be empowered to do.
To all ICE officers, you have federal immunity in the conduct of your duties. And anybody who lays a hand on you or tries to stop you or tries to obstruct you is committing a felony. You have immunity to perform your duties, and no one, no city official, no state official, no illegal alien, no leftist agitator or domestic insurrectionist can prevent you from fulfilling your legal obligations and duties.
Okay, Professor, I want to think about Stephen Miller's comments as they pertain to this moment. There's been public pushback and even talk of de-escalating federal enforcement a little bit by President Trump himself after the killings in Minneapolis. From a legal and historical perspective, is this likely to change how ICE operates?
I think Stephen Miller is right that ICE officers have an enormous amount of immunity. The legal system has granted federal and state law enforcement officers great leeway to use violence when carrying out their duties. This is an enormous part of the reason why it is so unusual to have any kind of law enforcement officer face criminal prosecution because of the violence that they use in the course of making an arrest or investigating criminal activity. And so I think he is right to say that they have an enormous amount of leeway. He's right to say that anyone who puts hands on a federal law enforcement officer can and probably will be arrested and prosecuted for some crime, maybe obstruction of justice or something along those lines. It's one thing to record what you're seeing. It's one thing to yell even profanities at law enforcement officers. It's another thing to actually touch them and to try to physically restrain or impede their ability to carry out their duties, no matter what you think about their duties. That is a fine line. What we've seen is that ICE and the Border Patrol have completely slashed that boundary and made it absolutely irrelevant, because what we're seeing is that they are going after people who are doing nothing more than expressing the kind of dissent and political activism that is a core component of the history of the United States and of political activity in the United States. And we see this in the most tragic example with Alex Preddy, who seemed to have been trying to get away from the agents, and they yanked him back into that scrum where seconds later they killed him.
We have run out of time, but I am hoping that we can have you back on the show, Professor, to talk more about your important work. Professor César Cuauhtémoc García Hernández studies immigration. He is at Ohio State University. His latest book is Welcome the Wretched: In Defense of the Criminal Alien. Thank you so much, Professor.
My pleasure.
It's the Metro on WDET. Up next, people have been protesting to remove ICE from the streets of Minneapolis. We'll speak with a Michigander who was there protesting next to them. Stay with us.